Okay, that was just sitting there listening to all the speakers coming from quite different angles, but at the same time, some really interesting overlaps. So I was thinking that, of course, one of the key things that are emerging is really how we need to rethink the role of the human in relation to the environment and other species that are there. And I think a number of the speakers were talking to that. So I'm just wondering if you can, maybe each of you talk a little bit about, because it seems that we need to, it's all very well having that commitment, but how do we make everyone else aware that this is something of importance and value, and maybe through more tangible propositions. So it was interesting to see, I think, ending on Marcus pointing out Natalie Jeremijenko's work with the, how she uses the health of animals to predict the health of humans and that sort of entanglement that we have. But also with Maria's work, how you're really rethinking facades of buildings and other kinds of forms that offer really new propositions. So I'm wondering if you'd like to talk to that sort of the human-animal relationship, but how we can really radically rethink that into something that's more prosperous for all of us.
Can you hear me? Good. So the way we look at it, it's the urban ecosystem, and that includes all different species, and to achieve this balance of interconnectedness, we wanted to bring it into the built environment and create a building system that it has living systems in it. And I think that's that paradigm shift that we are proposing. And then kind of how do you balance that system to serve all different species? And I think ultimately that will result in a healthy environment for everyone. And it's not kind of the recreating nature the way we know it, because it's highly engineered, and it's introducing, as I talked about, both bio-design but bioengineering, and it's introducing sensors and ability to measure and control this environment. But I think it's also bringing this level of knowledge and understanding, and a lot of it's about kind of this ultimate optimism and educating the public. And so working with the development, we think like having a facade with monarch butterflies will be a wonderful thing in New York, and everybody will come and see it. In fact, what has happened, now we have two major commissions with both the American Museum of Natural History, where we'll be designing their insectarium, and with the Cooper here at the Smithsonian, where if you're in New York next year, we'll be building a living prototype of this facade for their triennial. So it's becoming this kind of a path of educating the public and then demonstrating, and so it's in a commitment by big cultural institutions to take on these projects with us. I think it's a game changer.
I'm wondering, Christhina, have you got any thoughts about how something like the butterfly wall might end up in a workplace design environment, given that 90% of our time is spent indoors working?
I think it's already happening when you look into the rise of biophilic design and the implementation, well, bringing back nature into indoor environments. So I think there is a lot of potential. We need to understand a little bit more how much of that impacts people on the positive and negative side, but I can't really imagine any negative outcomes coming from a very nicely designed green wall within any indoor environment. It's just, this is what we as human beings expect to be in touch with. So we already know all the negative aspects of not being exposed to daylight, for example, for those people that don't work near a window. And also the benefits of being connected to any sort of outdoor view has on your perceived productivity. So that indicates to me that we should be taking more, care of these, tweaking the details to embrace that. So I think it's looking very positive for the next decade or so, but we need to do more than that, because can we actually start growing food indoors rather than just having an aesthetic future? Within an indoor environment. So I think I would hope that will be the next step, would be to actually make or take more advantage of these green features of any biophilic driven sort of design and take it to the next level. Yeah.
We've had this discussion over lunch around the fact that a lot of it that we perceive as being beneficial or positive for humanity is known. Like, for instance, that example you mentioned about the light impact on people's well-being in an office environment, or some of the examples that came up today. But for some reason, there seems to be a lack of it being translated into scale, into policy, into standards, into the way that these different pieces of R&D innovation get translated and leave academia. So we have proofs of concepts and prototypes, but I think what's missing really is that translational aspect, and it's really bizarre how the environmental movement, sometimes it's their own worst enemy, because they seem to be very comfortable being seen as the minority at the fringe, when a lot of this, especially if we are talking at the planetary scale, it needs to be scaled up to be mainstream. And so Paul Durisch wrote this interesting paper for the Designing Interactive Systems Conference in 2010, where he talks about the design of politics and the politics of design, where he talks about this notion of strategic essentialism, the idea that maybe all these different movements, there's some fighting for the dolphins, and I'm going on about the wombats, and others about we need to achieve this kind of level of mainstreaming and adoption where you would say, well, I'm a fan of oxygen. And you might find, that's a funny thing to say. Of course you're a fan of oxygen because you need oxygen to live, but it hasn't really reached that level. And I think in terms of scale and policy making and governance, we're not really at a level where we've realized the urgency of what we are facing. And maybe we need to have more bushfires and more disasters and more pain across the world for that urgency to be felt. I think maybe we are still too comfortable. On the other hand, you can also see with Brexit and with Trump and other kinds of political movements that people are also getting increasingly angry with the way that the system is set up. But there is this irony in that people are then voting for options that eventually are to their detriment. And that's been, philosophized and trying to be unpacked and analyzed in political science. And maybe it's actually this kind of intersection. I've had this nice Venn diagram. We actually got another kind of bubble moving into the space, which is the one around the political science, trying to understand what's going on. Why is all this great research happening here and the ones that we heard, but it doesn't go anywhere, and people are still building coal-fired power plants?
Thank you. Donna?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of assumptions that we make about ecology and nature in the city, so we still tend to see it as being primarily in parks and gardens and not so much as part of our own, we don't see our own microbiomes as being nature in the city. So I think there's still more work to be done in terms of thinking about what the non-human means and shifting the discourse around it. So one of my issues at the moment is that a lot of places are replacing grass with fake turf around Sydney, and there's there's I guess a sense in which that performs certain types of it might save water or money in terms of having to grow grass all the time, but it doesn't take into account other benefits such as soils and things like that. So I guess we have to look at the ethics and the choices and consequences of a whole range of things that are going on that often are not noticed. So that idea of noticing, I think, more is really important as well.
Just going back to, I'm trying to think ahead 100 years and what's actually going to be at our disposal then. Are we going to be living in a very dystopic world where there's been so many catastrophic things happening, nature's fought back, our cities are in rubble, and are we going back to a sort of like primitive survival thing, or are we moving into a highly, even more technologized future where everything is very interconnected and we have new materials at our disposal? So I think there's an interesting thing with raising the talks and some of Maria's stuff around how rethinking the materials we're building with. So we're not building with concrete and steel necessarily, but we may have these sort of biomaterials we're building with, and somehow there's a kind of intelligence in them that I think even with Marcus's work where you're thinking you might need to steer away from heavily technology-driven projects, maybe technology is even being rethought in 100 years' time, and how can we influence that so that the materials we're building with and the visions we have are actually very sustainable.
I mean, as I said before, I'm a perpetual optimist, but we also don't have a choice because we are facing material scarcities, natural material scarcities today, and there is some statistics that predict that by 2050 we'll double the whole built environment. Like everything that exists today will be doubled. So, and it's an enormous amount of materials, so we have to go and think about the circular economy and what materials we'll be using. And I think what I see now, the research, and also it's moving to practice. I mean, I've just joined a big engineering and design firm, Arab, and I see the research that is done there, and then what it's applying to buildings and a number of other large practices in New York City that I'm familiar with. So I think it's happening. It's a slow process. I think. We need to educate not just the general public, but the developers and the clients. But I don't think we have a choice, and I think it's starting to make good economic sense, and it affects the bottom line. So I think I think the green revolution happened. We won, and now if we are moving to how do we apply it to the built environment.
I think if we want to have a rich debate around the next 100 years at a Centenary Symposium, it cannot be limited to just design or architecture. It does need other influences, and so if I had the choice, we would add another couple of days to this to give voice to other disciplines that need to be heard and that need to be part of the mix. Like, for instance, already it was alluded to that we want to move and transition towards a circular economy model. That sounds like an economics problem, because if we try and leave this up to the people that are currently benefiting and the entities and organizations that are currently benefiting from the way the system is run, then they probably are less likely to wanting to transition to a new system. And so there is an inherent conflict of interest in the way that the structures of current powers and frameworks are preventing us from moving forward. And another big framework that we probably need an entire day on would be axiology, to actually look at ethics and values and the way that they give us direction. We are currently operating, well, not we, but maybe Canberra is largely operating in a moral vacuum, where a lot of decisions are made that are quite inhumane, and they obviously been flagged as such by global entities, and it seems we're still moving on, and that is possible, and we have bad leaders in other countries. That's also possible, but what still surprises me is that they get voted back in, right? So I think that is something to theorize about as well. What's wrong with Australia's axiology and value system, that all this evil is allowed to happen, and then you see this in the news, but we get upset about some people tampering with the cricket ball. I've been trying to get my head around this, and I think the reason is that people are not surprised when you have a corrupt politician, because we expect our politicians to be bad, but we did have our cricketers in very high esteem. And so even if they were, disappointing us, all hell broke loose. But all this other kind of evil that is being reported in The Guardian, it seems that the mainstream isn't really catching up, and I'm missing the protest. For instance, when Elizabeth showed that example of the trees being felled, I tweeted about the same incident in Stuttgart in Germany, where the Deutsche Bahn was trying to build an underground train station, and they started wanting to fell the trees there, and they said, oh, we've done everything. We've put the little ad in the Sunday Mail, and the paper had an announcement that that's what we're going to do, and you could have left your feedback, but no one saw the ad, so no one left the feedback, so now we are proceeding. But what happened back then is that the protests got so violent, the police had to get support from the military. This is in Germany. The entire state of Baden-Württemberg was in a state of emergency. It went on for months. I've watched it kind of via news coverage from here. And what was also interesting that state that was run by a conservative government for multiple decades was, for the first time, then they elected a Greens premier. And very successfully so, and he was re-elected again, and he's very successful in his leadership of that state now. And so I wonder what's different about some of the values across these different nation states and how they react to these global planetary challenges, and how we don't just have to catch up with our STEM education, with our engineering innovation here in Australia, but we actually have to catch up with our value system.
I think, yeah, definitely with ethics and values, it's something that's coming on the agenda, even in our education programs. But I think there's also a role for designers and visionaries to really paint those futures out there. But I think, but find very practical ways for people to engage with them. I just wanted to open up to the audience and see if anyone has a question they'd like to ask the panel.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question, probably the whole panel, but I think Maria might particularly be interested in this, and Marcus. I know that we mentioned before the stuffed passenger pigeon, the last of its type. But we were lucky we had a real pigeon flying. I don't know if you noticed it on the steps there. So we haven't quite lost all our pigeons yet. But I wanted to ask, I love the idea of the biophilia, that you're doing some amazing stuff there. But I'm just wondering whether you think it might work better developing it not just in the city, but maybe in outer suburban and regional areas where it might be easier to adopt rather than trying to retrofit it. I admire all your innovations that you're doing, and there's a wonderful need for it. But is there, do you think, a case for maybe doing it more on a regional or a outer suburban kind of hub level, rather than kind of focusing on the city, because that seems to be where cities are going? Because I don't think, as in Sydney, we want the city to keep growing and growing, because the connections between the different parts in terms of transport and other things become harder and harder the further you go out on the radius. So I just wondered if you wanted to comment, and if the other people wanted to comment on this idea, maybe that it might be easier to apply some of the things you've mentioned on a more regional hub-based level, rather than just trying to focus on the inner urban CBDs.
I mean, the way we think about urbanization in urban areas, that includes the suburban, and so a lot of these solutions are applicable to not just dense urban centers, but hubs that exist. So we don't really discriminate against different areas, and I think we're looking for early adopters, and it's easier to introduce it in a dense urban environment where it's, again, our goal is really education, and it's kind of part of the propaganda, right? We want to put it where a lot of people will see it and will call attention, and then will be adopted. That's why we start in the dense urban centers, but the solutions are definitely applicable everywhere.
I think it's also important to look at land use. So at a certain point, suburbs have come to get quite a bad reputation, encouraging sprawl and helping create our car-centric cities. But suburban back gardens often contain a lot of very valuable mature trees and habitat for non-human animals. And what we're seeing in a lot of particularly middle ring suburbs is infilling and people knocking down those gardens and putting up houses or multi-dwellings that take away those trees and gardens. So there's a lot of incongruencies, I think, in planning when we start to sort of, as Marcus talks about, scaling it up to look at what the accumulative effects across a metropolitan, suburban and also non-urban area are.
I think it's a really challenging question, and it's popping up. We've had a inquiry by the federal parliament. They went around and they had expert witnesses and so forth. And some of the questions that came up, it was themed around the role of the Australian government in the in city making. It had a longer title. But one of the questions was around decentralization. Could we have a decentralization policy in terms of looking at population distribution across Australia? Now, we are starting a new project that is looking at some aspects of this, and it's with the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales and with Cairns in far north Queensland. And what those colleagues have been talking to us about is that they are lacking the kinds of guidance of how to go about regional prosperity that takes regionality into account as an asset, not as an excuse or something to avoid. So a lot of the economic development policies for regional Australia are just copying Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney. In fact, there is even delegations coming to Melbourne taking photos of, pretty graffitied laneways, and then all of a sudden you find this in Toowoomba. And then the local residents are mocking it. They're actually saying, we are not sitting here in the peri-urban area of Toowoomba, so not necessarily in the inner city, waiting for this place to turn into Melbourne. We are living here because of the lifestyle, because of the leisure facilities, because of access to nature, because of the food systems, for a whole bunch of reasons. But the majority are not saying we're just waiting for this to finally turn into the next metropolitan area. And so, but that's exactly what happens. So a lot of these regional towns are obviously under a lot of pressure. City deals have been done for Western Sydney. South East Queensland is negotiating one. But interesting case is the one in Launceston, because they are under a lot of pressure to keep services running with regards to the need for population and population density. But at the same time, there seems to be an impetus to be catching up. But those cities are catching up to the kinds of problems and the kinds of high blood pressure that Sydney has got. And Sydney is catching up to the high blood pressures that, New York or LA or Mexico City has got. Now, is that the future we want? No. And so what's desperately needed is for leadership that actually sees and diagnoses that high blood pressure, and rather than putting money into accelerating that high blood pressure to the point of collapse, we actually need to think of it very differently and think about how we slow down. I think it's quite interesting to study the slow city movement, for instance.
That's an interesting proposition, Marcus, which I was just thinking of where you was talking about that, and I think it's come up too about this different temporal rhythms that we maybe need to think about in terms of how we live and the ecosystems we dwell in, and how we can actually design for those. So how do we design to slow down? How do we think of work productivity so it's not actually, pumping out productive work every second of the day, but there's actually like time for reflection, for reverie, for enjoying the movement, the dance of the butterflies as they flit around town. So there's, I think, another dimension that maybe that book, The Spell of the Sensuous, is pointing at, where the sensuous nature of life and our interconnections need to be sort of factored into the way we think about the planet, how we live. Is there another maybe last question from the audience before we wrap up? Or
Someone please ask a blockchain question. Come on. We cannot have a Centenary Symposium without
Sorry,
that.
that's the other room over there. That's that little dark room. Okay, I'd just like to close this panel talk by thanking our panel speakers again, Donna Houston, Maria Aiolova, Marcus Foth and Christhina Candido. It's been a really illuminating and interesting discussion with lots of things for us to think about, and think about how in our respective professions and lives we can actually deal with some of these dilemmas, and but also, as Maria said, be optimistic about the future that we can create. So thank you again. Thank you very much.